Okay. Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to session 3 on culture and compliance. And I want to just echo Seiji-san's remarks at the beginning of his session and just thanking the organizers, Fukami Sensei and others who were involved in setting this session up. This is my, I think, third year joining, so longtime fan, first-time moderator. But it's great to be here, and I've already learned so much from both of the sessions that have come before. Panel 1, we talked about sort of culture, a rigorous sort of dissection of what is it, how and where does it sort of emerge within organizations, how are narratives and norms spread across organizations, really fascinating questions, even so far as to talk about some of the physiological sort of differences or manifestations around sort of decision making. So for this panel, we're going to sort of do a slight pivot where we are still going to talk about culture as it sort of manifests within organizations, but we're going to be looking at culture in the context of regulation and compliance. And so, I'm really sort of pleased to be joined by my esteemed sort of panelists. And so I thought that, maybe we can just start with some very quick introductions. And if Simon, if you can hear us.
I can.
Good morning.
Morning.
Simon, if you could maybe just quickly introduce yourself, and then I'll ask Ruth and John here on stage with me to introduce themselves. But Simon, just a quick introduction, please.
Thank you, Yuri. An introduction for me, I'm Simon Airy. I head up the corporate crime and investigations team at international law firm McDermott, Will and Schulte based in London. An apology, I'm on vacation with my family in Spain, hence my casual attire. I'm very sad not to be in your beautiful country, particularly at this time of year. I've been there every year for 3 or 4 years now, and I'm very sorry not to be with you in person. But glad to be joining you today, even if remotely.
Thank you, Simon. Thanks for dialing in from Spain. Ruth.
So I'm Ruth Steinholtz. Is this on? Can you hear me? Yeah. So actually, Japan has been in my consciousness forever because I grew up with an uncle who spoke Japanese and who came back from Japan with lots of wonderful presents and knowledge, and it talked to me a lot about the culture. And then coincidentally, I joined, my first law firm was Graham and James. And for you very old timers, you might know that they were the first U.S. law firm to establish a permanent presence in Japan in 1955. And the man who did that was my first boss and mentor a few decades after that. He has just died age 100 last year, Alexander D. Calhoun. I think he would be delighted to see that I was here. So I started my career as a lawyer in San Francisco in private practice. Because my languages were European languages, I pivoted to Europe pretty early, went to Italy, and followed my career into in-house. And I've worked in Italy. I worked in Cairo for 3 years. And then I went in-house, went to the UK. And I've worked in 3 different industries, always in a global or regional role. And in my last role as general counsel in a petrochemical industry, I got very much into finding a better way to do compliance through culture and values. And that led me eventually to decide that I'd had enough of being a lawyer. So I call myself a recovering lawyer, but I've discovered that you never recover from being a lawyer. So, just to tell you, for those of you who are wondering. And I set up my own small organization trying to help organizations develop more balance in their approach to compliance through culture and values. And I've also very honored to have written a book with a gentleman called Chris Hodges Sensei, who was an Oxford Don at the time, about ethical business practice and regulation. So I'm very honored to be here, and thank you very much for the invitation. Daisuke.
Thank you, Ruth, and we're honored to have you here with us. And John.
Thanks, Yuri. And thank you, Daisuke, for inviting me. I'm John Lane. I'm a partner at Nagashima, Ono, and Tsunamatsu. I started my career in London and worked there for 10 years in financial services, disputes, regulatory investigations. I came to Japan 8 years ago now and have been with Nagashima the entire time. I've been very busy helping Japanese clients navigate some of the challenges with overseas regulators and litigants. And I look forward to sharing some of those stories with you today.
Thanks very much, John. Finally, my name is Yui. I'm from AlixPartners, and I help to lead a team at AlixPartners called Integrated Risk Management, where we try to bring together folks with a background in behavioral science, with folks who have a background in kind of organizational design and development, with folks who really understand enterprise data. And what we're trying to do is to kind of bring these three threads together to think about how compliance programs can be designed and operated differently to how they're done today. And so, both panel 1, panel 2, and this entire symposium is very near and dear to my heart. Today, how I thought we'd kind of run this session, given sort of, the backgrounds of our panelists, we'll really be walking through 2 or 3 sort of big questions, if you will. The first question we'll start with is really around how regulators are thinking about and developing expectations for companies and their executives around the use of culture to get better sort of conduct outcomes, if you will. It's a very complex question. The second question that we'll then talk about is really about sort of, companies, not just in Japan, but companies that sort of have a heritage outside of kind of the Western context, if you will. And we'll talk a little bit about sort of some of the challenges that are unique to these companies in being able to accurately understand, interpret, and translate some of these regulations and expectations into sort of, compliance policies or sort of programs designed to sort of develop culture within their organizations. So we have a lot to cover. I'm sure we won't cover all of it in 45 minutes, but we have a lot, so we'll kind of dive right in. And Simon, I want to maybe start with you, and for folks in the room who've joined a number of these seminars or symposium, culture and sort of compliance may be sort of quite a natural, a pairing, but for the uninitiated, culture and compliance are quite an odd pairing. Right. When you say the word culture, to me, that's something that I think is quite organic. It's something that's lived. It's something that emerges between sort of a group of people with shared experiences. And on the other hand, when you mention the word kind of compliance, it's a very different connotation. Compliance to me feels much more synthetic, engineered, forced, imposed on other people to get a certain outcome. And so, it's kind of an odd pairing, if you will. And so my question to you, Simon, maybe to kick us off, is to talk to us a little bit about how culture and compliance have kind of been brought together in the UK. What was it a reaction to? And also, if you can talk a little bit about sort of the it's been maybe 2 decades or more since the UK has kind of had a regulatory focus on governance and culture and conduct. What's changed, right? And how would you kind of score that? How has the UK been doing in terms of delivering better conduct outcomes as a result of focusing on culture?
Yeah, thanks for that question, Yui. I'm going to be really interested to hear what Ruth defines as culture and compliance. She's a true expert, but in trying to answer your question, let me tell you what I think those things equate to. It's important to break them down. What is culture? Well, to me, culture is the concept of having shared values, attitudes, behaviors that define an organization. In a corporate setting, that's essentially translates into how a company does business, how it treats its shareholders, how it treats its customers, the market, the public, even its competitors, how it relates to the environment and how it wins business. That often translates into the concept of doing business ethically, which I think we all understand in principle. Compliance is something different. You're absolutely right. That is something that is synthetic. It's imposed. In essence, to me, it's complying with laws, regulations, and internal policies, often translated into a code of conduct. The danger of that is that that can be synthetic and it becomes a tick box exercise. I like to talk about what I call the culture of compliance. What does that do? That blends those two things so that, in essence, ethical behaviors become embedded in everyday conduct. So it's not just a tick box exercise. And I'm passionately of the view that that's got to start at the top. Our American cousins use the expression tone from the top. I've always believed that good culture and a good culture of compliance starts and ultimately ends in the boardroom. If an organization in its management does not breathe and believe in these concepts, then its people can't be expected to follow. It's important that the culture flows through the whole organization. And part of that is education as well as standing by those principles rigidly. People have got to understand and believe why it's important to do the right thing, and why certain rules exist. So with that kind of background, how to answer your first question, how did culture become a matter of regulation? Well, the short answer is that in the real world, companies don't always behave properly because certain people don't behave properly. And that's often senior managers or even at board level, where the messaging and the behaviors just aren't correct. And we see examples of that all across the world. People are greedy, or they don't want to do things the right way. They want to do it the easy way, the quickest way. In a competitive environment, they might be concerned to earn a bonus, to meet their targets, to earn the biggest profit for the company. They may believe that the only way to do business is to win at any cost. And it may well be that in winning a bigger share of the market, they make mistakes, and then the culture is to conceal those mistakes or illegal behavior to win business. So what happens is that governments then react and they impose laws and regulations as a result of scandals and problems. The problem with that, of course, is that with more and more laws and regulations, we have something that I see all the time, and I'm sure Ruth and John will speak to, and that's the concept of compliance fatigue. People get very concerned and exhausted by this tick box exercise where they've got codes of conduct that are too big, too long, and too detailed, and start to govern the only way that they think, with their head rather than through their heart. And in many instances, that means that they don't end up doing the right thing. In the United Kingdom, examples probably stem from the financial crisis in 2008, where the government imposed a whole range of laws, regulation, and codes of conduct. I'm sure Ruth will talk about, corporate governance at the heart of this. But there was a real attempt to do things differently. We had everything from the senior managers and certification regime in relation to banks. All companies were made subject to the UK Bribery Act as long ago as 2010. The Ministry of Justice guidance relating to that legislation spoke very firmly about the need for what it referred to as top-level commitment. In other words, a clear adherence to concepts of culture. We saw deferred prosecution agreements being introduced as a concept in 2014. The Criminal Finances Act then brought in a new offence of failure to prevent tax evasion. Many of you have heard me speak on the topic of ECTA, the Economic Crime and Corporate Transparency Act, the biggest extension to corporate criminal liability in over 150 years. And now we learn from the government we have something called the Crime and Policing Bill, which is going to extend those offences, the failure to prevent fraud in ECTA, to a failure to prevent all crimes. If that happens, you can see that we have a very rigid code and set of laws indeed. But they are a reaction to a lack of culture, a lack of compliance, and they show that with every period of time that passes, new laws are needed to restrict, control, and guide companies and people how they behave. So that suggests to me that over the past 2 decades to answer your second question, relating to whether or not that's resulted in measurably better outcomes. I think the short answer to that is that it's a mixed response. And we see that because we see consistent examples of enforcement. Prosecutions, deferred prosecution agreements. We see individuals being prosecuted as much as companies. And so whilst I'm pleased to say that over that period of time, I have seen a lot of good culture embedded in a lot of good companies, the landscape remains mixed and rocky, and we've all got a lot more to do, which is precisely why we're all here at this conference, and precisely why I'm delighted to hear Ruth tell us now what all the answers are.
Well, I can't improve on your definition of culture, Simon. That was perfect, actually. A short definition would be the way we do things around here. But I think the way you described it was exactly the point of it influences everything, how people behave. And it's made up of shared values that we actually share, which some of them might not be positive. Values that we say that we share, which are the ones that you find on the wall in a poster in the boardroom, and then there are lots of artifacts, the policies, but all kinds of things, company history, shared experience, etc., that influence culture. Leaders, of course, influence it the most, and what you need to think about is that sometimes it isn't the current leaders who are influencing the culture, because you may have had leaders in the past who created a type of culture which may or may not have been a healthy culture or an ethical culture, and years after they've left, people are still doing things as a reaction to that culture, which no longer weren't probably appropriate then, but aren't necessary. But I think you raised a couple of important points, and maybe one additional point about how culture came into the regulatory environment. The Dutch National Bank, many years ago, sent a bunch of their supervisors, they were conduct supervision, they sent them to universities to get PhDs in behavioral science. And they wrote a very good book on supervising culture. And I met Wynand Nauts, who was the head of that division, a few times when we were working on the book. And basically, they actually send supervisors into the boardroom. So they talk to the senior managers of financial services organizations and sit in on board meetings. Now, my co-author, Chris Hodges, and I have a slight objection to that in the sense that it's probably changing the way people are behaving in the board meetings, having a supervisor there. And we think that organizations should be able to give evidence of what their culture is like to the supervisor rather than the supervisor coming in and deciding for themselves. But some combination of that. Anyway, long answer short, the Dutch National Bank has influenced, I think, the Financial Services Agency, people in Australia, Singapore, et cetera. So that idea of supervising conduct, I think, in the financial services industry also is a result of them. But I think there are a couple of important things that I wanted to mention. So overall, culture influences how people comply. Now, I have a problem with the word compliance because to me, compliance is doing what you're told without questioning. And we have tons of examples in the world right now where that is a very bad thing. So compliance, for me, that's why I focus on culture and values, because I want a culture where people can actually question authority. Now, I know that's a very difficult thing in Japanese culture, and it's a difficult thing, frankly, everywhere. But if you cannot question an order, if it goes against your values, ultimately what happens is that the good people who don't want to do things that violate their own values will leave, and you'll be having more and more people who are willing to just do whatever they're being asked to do. And the other thing is that a lot of times good people do bad things. So because of the system or how wanting to conform, for example, not wanting to put their head above the parapet, as we say. In other words, not wanting to stand out and speak up. Some people will go along with things. And there's a lot of research on this. It goes back actually decades. You can tell because of the haircuts on the videos, very 1960s haircuts. But not wanting to appear different from the crowd. So following orders, belonging, and a lot of other reasons why. I've outlined some of them in the slides, which you'll have afterwards. So it's if you just blame one person, in other words, if you blame the last person who did a thing, and you don't look at the root causes that contributed to why that thing happened, you probably are going to, first of all, not solve the problem, the underlying problem, and you're going to give the message to all of your other employees that that if they speak up, or they're just going to be blamed. And if you have a blame culture, you're not going to have a learning or improvement culture. So I think that's, and in the UK, Simon, I think you may agree with this, that during the pandemic, because the government didn't comply with its own rules, and that was very visible, I've seen a general degradation in other spheres of compliance, running red lights, crossing the street. I mean, we've always crossed the street not at the green man, so to speak, but now it's become, I think, much more chaotic. So visible non-compliance has increased because those in authorities were flaunting the rules. So maybe that's a good place to stop and for now.
I mean, there's so much there that I'm sure we'll need to kind of come back to. But if we pivot for a moment, and John, this is really to you. One of the things that came up during the first panel, which I thought was quite interesting, is kind of the idea of narratives. And if I could maybe paraphrase a little bit, we each sort of see the world differently through our own unique lenses that are informed by our own experiences, if you will, right? And so if you sort of, scale that up to the level of kind of regulation and companies that are subject to regulation, you've got regulators in places like the UK, US, Australia, elsewhere, that are sort of defining rules, expectations based on their unique set of lenses that are defined by what they consider to be sort of normal and common sense. And then you've got sort of companies that are trying to kind of, discern what is being intended through these rules and then somehow translate that into how they sort of conduct business in these jurisdictions. So given your sort of unique experience, across kind of the UK, US, but also, last 8 years in Japan, what have you sort of seen in terms of where there's kind of a risk of, lost in translation, where regulators and sort of companies that have a footprint here in Japan are not necessarily seeing eye to eye?
Thanks, Yui. I can share several anecdotes. Let me start with one, and it's ties in nicely to what Simon said about tone from the top. But before I get into the anecdote, let me just set a ground rule. Sometimes I hear people perhaps not say, but imply, this is the way we do things in our country, and you're not doing it properly, and therefore you're unsophisticated. That has not been my experience here. I think, so all my clients are corporates, large Japanese corporates predominantly. I think it would be extremely naive to believe that they aren't sophisticated. They are highly sophisticated. So why do we have problems sometimes? Well, that's because they're often highly sophisticated operating in the Japanese ecosystem. And they're very logical. But when their companies encounter problems outside the Japanese ecosystem, they can't draw on the same experience to get the same good outcomes. And so this leads me to my anecdote. And it's not about fraud happening in Japan. Fraud happens in all countries. It's about looking at, once it's identified, how are we handling it? And this is where there is sometimes the disconnect, which leads me to the anecdote. So a company uncovered fraud. They took advice. They did the right thing. They reported it to the regulator. They made a public disclosure. And in those circumstances, naturally, the regulator, the public, would expect that the product in question is going to stop being sold. Now, it largely was. But what the company hadn't shared was that the misconduct was probably a bit wider than they had told the public. So if they stopped sales for everything that was affected, more questions would be asked. And of course, the advice to the company is, well, the final decision is up to you, but let us explain what could happen if you continue to sell this product and the regulator finds out. And it's not a surprise to hear that the regulator wouldn't have much sympathy for that, particularly because it's a bad decision after the original fraud. Nobody can prevent fraud, but you can control how you react to it when it's discovered. And so the company understood that the regulator wouldn't act favorably. The regulator may see it as an aggravating factor. They may bring charges against individual criminal charges. And the company, of course, listened to all this and decided to continue to sell the product. And you're thinking, wow, as Simon said, that must be because of corporate greed. I have a different take on it. I don't think it's because of money or corporate greed. I think the calculus here was different. I think the thinking was this. I understand what you lawyers are telling me, but if I stop selling this product now, it's going to create a lot of inconvenience. I'm going to have to go back to the public and explain it. They're going to ask more questions. Why didn't you tell us about this the first time? I'm going to have to go to my customers who have already asked me, is this particular product affected? And we've already told them, no, it's not. But now I'm going to have to tell them it is. I'm going to have to tell my suppliers that, I'm sorry, we can't buy your components now because we're going to have to stop selling the product. You can see where this is going. It's not a money fact. It's an inconvenience, I think, shame fact, possibly. I haven't reached final conclusions on this, so everybody's view is very welcome here. So ultimately, one more point is, in my experience, if you very clearly advise somebody here, you cannot do this because this will happen, then they won't do it. But you might often get a question, which is, are you sure? Can you guarantee me that's going to happen? And like any good lawyer, I'm going to say, well, in my experience, I'm fairly certain this is a serious risk, but I can't guarantee you it's going to happen. I can't tell you with 100% certainty. And what I've found here is people like focus in on that, and it gives them a wiggle room, and they say, well, I hear what you're saying, but how do we know? I might be a little cynical. I think the more charitable explanation is, what what we're advising is often not one of the possible outcomes in Japan. So because it hasn't been encountered within the domestic ecosystem, it's harder to imagine. So that's one reason. No experience domestically. The second reason, I think, and this is the final point, not all, but many Japanese companies, including prominent Japanese companies, don't have a general counsel with a direct line of communication into the board. And that can create problems because you only have outsiders, essentially. Yes, they're your lawyers, they're your advisors, but they're not within the company. The successes we've seen are where companies do have people on the inside who can say, you know what, I've seen that happen before, and we should take what the advisors are saying very seriously. And because that person is on the inside, then that sometimes can be a good news story and means that this doesn't happen.
I mean, this is a really interesting anecdote, and one where, I've got questions kind of both for you, Ruth, and for Simon, but I want to just sort of imagine what's happening inside the boardroom upon receiving that advice, right? Because there is one path ahead where the company says, look, we need to actually look at kind of the full extent of the products that are impacted by this fraud, and we need to make systemic sort of changes. And then there's another path where, I think to your point, it's, that would create all sorts of inconveniences for, various stakeholders, our customers, our suppliers, our employees. And so let's kind of focus on what's been sort of, exposed. And my question to you, Ruth, is, how do you create a culture where in that boardroom it is feasible for someone to consider the former option?
That's a good question. I think, so the UK, the Corporate Governance Act and a report before that, back in 2018, said that basically culture is the responsibility of the board, and that the board needs to align their strategy, their culture, and their values. Now, my experience with boards is that most of them, particularly the non-executives, don't know enough about the culture, really, to be able to carry out that role as well as they should. However, if you have a board, and this does take education, who understand that a healthy culture, which is a culture where you can view mistakes as opportunities to learn and do the root cause analysis that we talked about earlier, is not only good for you from a compliance perspective, but also from a financial perspective, that ultimately having a healthy culture is going to be good for the bottom line. So if you, as a head of, as the general counsel or the head of ethics and compliance, whatever your role is, spend time educating your board, starting with your management board, but also your non-executive board, if you have that, as to the business benefit of a healthy ethical culture, and not, and apologies to the litigators in the room, and not from a legal perspective. In other words, if you go around making presentations saying, in our industry there have been such and such number of fines, and so many people have been arrested, which is usually, by the way, a very small number, and so people are going to risk assess that it's not likely to happen to them, you will be giving the message to them and everyone else that we're only doing this because it's the law, which will lead to cynicism in your employees who will think, okay, it's window dressing, it's not real, so I don't need to worry about this. And if you're then have people saying, you have to make these numbers and these numbers are unrealistic, that's just going to reinforce the message, which is, okay, I'm saying one thing, but you need to do something else. So the culture, personally, my approach is always to say, identify your real values, your true values, through consultation with your entire organization. Do not sit in the boardroom and pick words out of the air because other companies have had them as their values. Respect, integrity, they're meaningless. They really need to be developed, and there are ways of doing it. I've helped several companies to do it. Identify your true values, because then both your management and your board and your employees will feel that they had a role in identifying them and will own them. Okay, behavioral science calls that the IKEA effect. If you helped even in the smallest way to put a table together, you think it's more valuable. So personally, that's where I would start.
That's, I mean, I think my experience mirrors a lot of what you're sort of saying, where previously, there was a lot of specialization and silos created within organizations, right? You had people in finance who all studied some type of quantitative, field in school, came through kind of a corporate finance type of track. They speak a particular language, they're a tribe. You have HR who's the same, and then people in kind of strategy operations the same. And you don't speak the same language. And so I think what you're saying...
And you're not speaking together.
And you're not speaking together, right? Exactly. So in that anecdote that John was talking about, and this hypothetical of what could have been done to create an actual, feasible sort of culture environment where people at the board meeting, the management meeting, could have said, hey, maybe we should look at all the products affected by kind of this misconduct or this fraud. Part of that is getting, I don't want to say the compliance officer, but let's say the compliance officer, the GC, to speak the same language as finance so that they can actually articulate using the same language to say, here is the long-term projected value of doing the right thing, of ethics and integrity and reputation for our business in terms of our market share, for instance. Whereas a lot of folks that I've come across, with that background of kind of compliance, legal, they don't necessarily have the language or the ability to speak in those terms. And Simon, I guess a question that I want to sort of ask you, and I know that you've worked with a lot of kind of multinationals, and so, this is really more of a practical question, if you will. But listening to this, if you are from legal compliance, you may be thinking, this all sounds great, but at the end of the day, I go back to my desk and I've just learned that my budget has been cut by 20%. So it's not the luxury of being able to do everything that the regulation expects me to do, put in the frameworks, write the policies, do the training, right? It's not that and being able to do a lot of what we're talking about in terms of tone from the top and a lot of the more cultural, behaviorally sort of informed initiatives. It's obviously, it's going to become either or. And that's really where I've seen a lot of fear, because if we either do the thing that regulators are expecting, which is just tick the box compliance, it feels like, I'm doing what everybody else is doing and I'm not going to be penalized for it. But if I'm actually saying, well, I'm not going to do some of that stuff, but instead I'm going to actually try some of this more, leading edge sort of thinking about how to sort of influence how people conduct themselves, behave. And if they come to you for advice, is this going to stand up, in front of a regulator if there were to be some type of misconduct that's identified? What's some of the advice, or how would you sort of take a client like that through that thought process?
Let me go back a step. 2 days ago, Japan beat England in football. And I was reading the news about it, and there were dozens of stories relating to the conduct of the Japanese fans, who, as they left the stadium, picked up and took away with them all of their rubbish. Now, is that culture or compliance? I think that's culture. That's something that's deeply embedded in Japanese culture. We see in Japan so many ways of behaving that are based upon historical norms or behaviors that are awesome to see. Cleanliness, efficiency, politeness, beautiful artistry, exactitude in ways of rendering so many different types of life, deeply embedded. If you translate that sometimes to a corporate culture in Japan, I often experience an element of rigidity. John and Ruth both spoke about behaviors being a little bit more natural, there being an open culture where people can address mistakes without shame, they can escalate issues, etc. These are the type of things that I think are at the heart of good culture. And if they are evident to regulators, in other words, that there is a genuine attempt to do the right thing, to face up to mistakes, then I think regulators are going to be often very much more sympathetic. I agree with John. It's not always the case that companies are just about making money. If we accept that culture essentially starts and ends in the boardroom, when things go wrong, senior managers are often afraid of being accountable. They're afraid of the consequences, their reputation, the reputation for the company. And sometimes that results in a closed culture or a desire to brush things under the carpet. The reality is that we exist in the modern world, and shredding documents isn't the way forward any longer. There are so many agencies of government with powers, investigative journalists, stakeholders, joint venture holders who have the ability to investigate and expose, that there's a danger if we continue with a culture of cover-up. I've always believed firmly that in this modern day and age where all companies are essentially multinational, we should be using compliance as a differentiator. Come and do business with us because your customers, your reputation, your health is safe with us. Invest in our companies and in our country, and we will do great business together. And that is the way that we will beat the competition. That's the type of behavior that regulators look for when things do go wrong. Is this just a mistake? And can it essentially be forgiven? Can we work with it? Or is it part of business as usual? Do certain parts of the company turn a blind eye to the way that people behave because that is the easy, the lazy way to do business or to make profit? They're big questions, of course, but I do sense that the world is changing, and I see an increasing harmonization of standards and laws across the world, which are engineered, I think, to try and create a much more level playing field internationally for ethical companies to do business in. Again, very rules-based, which is why I'm so fascinated by what Ruth says. How do we instill that true culture in the heart of an organization and its people so that actually we need fewer rules and fewer regulations? It's a big debate.
Yes, Simon, the FT agrees with you. A couple of years ago, I remember sitting at my desk and it was a short FT article. Thanks. And the title of the article, it was focused on Japan. And it said, "Getting caught remains the biggest risk in the eyes of bosses involved in cover-ups." And even though this is a few years old, I think it's fair to say that mentality, well, perhaps not, 100% the case. It remains widespread.
Can I? So I think the other thing we have to think about is all of these compliance programs that we've been implementing for the last 20-odd years. There is now research that basically says that most of them are completely ineffective. There are some that have found that, for example, they've changed they've made a 2% or a 3.5% difference in unethical behavior. Now, that doesn't seem like a very good return on investment to me. And I think that the sort of research in this area, there's more and more of it, and more of it is being reported. So I think both from the regulator's perspective and business perspective, there's sort of thinking about, well, there have to be better ways of doing this that are more cost effective. And so this point, and I agree with Simon completely, that if your efforts are more in creating a values-oriented approach, which doesn't mean you don't have policies and procedures and frameworks, but they are much simpler than they otherwise would be. And in fact, there's a quote from 1749, Cesare Beccaria, who wrote on crime and punishment. And he basically said, if you want people to obey the law, make it clear and simple. So, it's been around for a long time. It's nothing new. But my point is that it is pretty clear that these values-based approaches are more effective, and within them you have rules, et cetera, but you're focused on intrinsic motivation. We're doing this because it's important and we believe in it. One final point, I see we're running out of time. Earlier, Seiji and I spoke about ethics ambassadors or champs. One of the ways that you permeate through your organization values and culture and compliance is by having a group of people throughout the organization. I call them ethics ambassadors. We started doing this in Borealis back in 2005. And essentially, it's people from all different parts of the organization. And it goes to your point, which I totally agree with, break down those silos between all of the different areas. And so these are employees who are doing another job, and on top of that, they're spending 5 or 10% of their time over the course of a year helping you to get the importance of values and compliance and do some of the training, face-to-face conversation. So it's a two-way thing. You'll learn more about the problems that people face. They'll be talking in the language of the people. And I think that's one of the, and people tend to listen to their peers. There's research on that as well. So I think, we're talking about, Vincent was talking about disruption. And I think maybe we need to use this period of time when AI is causing disruption to disrupt the whole sort of ecosystem of what we're doing. And I think, that it's a good place to start.
No, absolutely. And I know that we are kind of running short on time, so I just want to make sure everyone gets kind of one final kind of thought or word in. And if I'm sitting in the audience, there's a lot that we've sort of covered, and I may be sort of wondering, what do I bring with me back to my desk on Monday? And so, if each of you can kind of think of a question, right, that, our audience members can sort of ask of their own organizations in terms of their efforts around nurturing or developing a culture of ethics and integrity and getting kind of the desired compliance outcomes. What would that sort of question sort of be? And maybe we'll kind of go in reverse order. So maybe John, I can kind of start with you, and then I'll move back to Simon.
Management changes happen quite regularly in Japan. You've got a new senior leadership team, a new CEO. I think take advantage of that change. It's a new generation coming up. They're not necessarily going to have the same values as the previous generation. I'll keep it short.
Thank you. Yeah, very sweet and sweet. Ruth.
So I think the question you should ask is, why are we doing this? If the answer is we're only doing this because it's the law, then you have two choices. You go work for another company because that's not going to be a fun job, or you you say, actually, that's not an effective way of doing this, and we need to do this for all the reasons that I talked about earlier. But you need to understand what your senior management think is the purpose of doing it.
And it's the genuineness or the sincerity of that answer, right? It's not the templated, why are we doing this, but...
You need to have your antenna out of it. And in Japan, this should be the idea that you hear what isn't said. And you understand how people are... I mean, one of the things I've experienced over the last 2 days is I haven't had to say anything when I've been out and about and needed help. People just kind of came over and said, and helped me. So I feel you are more empathetic somehow, perhaps as a culture, maybe. But so hearing what isn't being said, I think, becoming a very acute listener is important for us in our roles.
Thank you. And Simon?
Look, there are many questions that all of us and all of our clients ought to be asking themselves every day. But one that's always resonated for me, I used it as a concept when I first started practice 35 years ago, and I'm sorry to say I still am. Can I pass the red face test? In other words, would I be happy to have my conduct described, let's say, on the front page of a national newspaper? And that often educates us about what is the right thing to do. We all kind of know what it is. We don't need rules and regulations to tell us or a code of conduct. I totally agree with Ruth. Most of us know, just by being born and our lived experience that you spoke about, you at the beginning, we ought to have that culture. And it can be topped up occasionally with a little bit of learning, but the test is there. Can I pass that red face test? Am I happy for this to be on the front page of a newspaper?
Thank you, Simon. And thank you again to our panelists and to our audience. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.